Hello and welcome to episode number 20 of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. Today is Sunday, October 19th, 2014. I'm Melissa Agnes, and this podcast is brought to you by Agnes Day. A side note before we jump into the podcast, we seem to have a little bit of technical difficulty while recording the podcast, so you hear a little bit of background noise behind us while we have our conversation. However, the content is really valuable, so I hope you stick through it, and I'll make sure on my end that it doesn't happen again. So with that said, let's talk crisis intelligence. Hi, Bill. Welcome to the show. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about what you do?
My name is Bill Boyd. I'm currently a corporate health and safety coordinator for Coastal Industrial Services, an industrial services firm out of California. I'm based out of Washington State. I spent 30 years in the fire service, retired in 2012 as fire chief for the Bellingham, Washington Fire Department. During that time, I served as a firefighter, paramedic, fire captain, public information officer, assistant fire chief, regional type 3 incident commander under FEMA all hazards IMT, and also a hazmat certified incident commander.
So many roles.
Yeah, it was quite the career.
No kidding. Awesome. And you and I met, I think we met on Twitter, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we met on social media, as well as I've met lots of people interested in crisis communications and emergency response on Twitter. We're kind of our own little family, it seems.
Yeah, it's a great place to, likewise, actually, I've met some really awesome people on Twitter.
Yeah, and I understand you got to meet Brian Humphrey in person here recently.
I did. So Brian and I had known each other for a few years through Jonathan Bernstein. And he was at, I did an earthquake simulation for the city of LA last week, and Brian was there.
Oh, great. Yeah, he's a great guy. We had an opportunity to participate in a panel discussion for the Department of Homeland Security. Probably been about 3 or 4 years ago now, and it was a lot of fun.
Cool. And actually not through Brian, through Twitter, actually, I met Eric Scott, and I got a tour of the city of LA's DOC, their EOC, their Station 4 fire departments, and all that fun stuff, where actually Brian works as well, alongside Eric. So that was awesome. That was cool.
Great.
Yeah. So you and I are here to talk about the Ebola crisis, how the CDC and other organizations are handling the crisis, doing their crisis management, how they're communicating with the public, and I'm so excited to talk about this because there's so much to talk about, and I think there's so many lessons too, good and bad, to learn from for our listeners.
Sure, I call it a target-rich environment right now.
Oh yeah, big time. So let's start at the beginning. So let's set the stage. So Ebola started in West Africa and has killed thousands of people over there, and thousands more are infected. And currently, 8 Americans in total are infected, not in the U.S., but in total, Americans, 5 of which are abroad, and 3 locally infected, if I'm not mistaken, on U.S. soil. One of those 3 has passed away. And fortunately, I'm in Canada right now, and nothing has come to Canada yet, but it's starting to trickle off in France and Britain and Spain and Germany and Norway. So we're going to just continue to see this escalate before it gets better, I think.
I agree.
And so looking at everything, there's so many. I mean, we could talk about Emory University Hospital, who did a brilliant job in handling the digital noise that was, consuming their online presence and calming the fear and actually curing the 2 missionary doctors, but which I think is a great case study. But what about the CDC? What are you feeling right now? At first, when patient 0 was diagnosed with Ebola on U.S. soil, which was, I believe, 2 weeks ago now. I wrote a blog post right away that evening where just taking a look at what the CDC was doing to communicate. And I have to say that they know social, they know how to reach the most amount of people. There's a couple things that I would do differently that we could talk about, but right away there was no masking anything, which was very, very important at the onset of this crisis in the U.S.
Yeah, I would agree with that. They were very upfront in putting out lots of information across all of their various platforms, and obviously we don't back here on the left coast, I call it. I'm not privy to any other discussion that would be going on behind the scenes directly between hospitals and the CDC and the states and the CDC through their internal networks. With briefings and webinars and things like that. But the public external communication with us, public, seemed to be pretty comprehensive. We could talk about the content later about what they were saying, but as far as getting information out there, being upfront, saying, yeah, it's here, here's what we're doing, here's what's going on, I felt like they did a pretty good job.
Yeah, likewise. And so then I know his last name was Duncan, the man who died from Ebola. So he was patient zero, and he ended up dying. There were mistakes that were made on behalf of Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital, which is where he entered. Actually, he entered, I think, 3 days before he was diagnosed, 3 or 4 days before he was diagnosed with a fever, and he told the nurses that he had been in West Africa previously, a few days before, and they misdiagnosed him, sent him home with some antibiotics, where he continued to get worse, and a few days later was brought in by ambulance and diagnosed with CDC, with Ebola.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of backlash right now going on about that, about the misdiagnosis, about actually yesterday I watched the U.S. House of Representatives. I spent like 2 hours watching their discussion, I guess.
How about grilling?
Yeah, and it's very frustrating because the people who were on the panel, the people, Dr. Frieden, the director of the CDC, was there. A whole bunch of really important people were there to talk about what they were doing and open to ideas and new concepts if there were any. But I felt like it just never got anywhere, and not because of them, because of the House of Representatives. They drilled with questions, didn't really listen to the answers, were more absorbed in making their points. And I have to say that there's a lot of discussion and heated conversations, I guess, around the topic of not banning flights. And first of all, let me ask you about that. What do you think? Not restricting flights from West Africa to the U.S.
Frankly, I'm torn on that. I think that doing that creates other issues. People mask the disease. People will try to do anything they can to get out, to get home, whatever. So I don't think that would work. I think it would drive people underground and figure out ways to get back, traveling to other countries by car or bus or whatever, and then flying out from there. I just don't see that practically working.
I agree.
I think it would have a global impact on economies. Obviously, airlines would suffer as Frontier is experiencing right now. I don't think practically it would work.
I agree, and you're right. Frontier, just for listeners who aren't aware, the second nurse who was diagnosed with Ebola took a flight one day before she had very severe symptoms of Ebola. So I guess before she was diagnosed, one day before, and that flight, it's a Frontier flight, and they are now calling all passengers who were on that flight as well as a few flights afterwards, because that plane obviously refueled and went back out. So just as a precautionary measure, and Frontier is actually doing a really great job at communicating, excuse me, communicating, but also going above and beyond. So they put their entire staff who was on that flight on paid leave for 21 days just to be careful, just to make sure. And they also went above and beyond the CDC's regulations and completely took off the covers of the chairs and put new ones in, redid the carpeting, all kinds of things like that, just to go above and beyond, just to to be as safe and secure as possible for their customers and their staff.
Sure, and I think that's a really good move and is indicative of, I think, a strategy that anybody involved in this, what I would call a crisis at this point, at least a crisis in credibility for certain agencies and staff. We're going to have to do that, irrespective of CDC guidelines. There's I won't call it paranoia, but I do call it Fearbola. We need to treat the Fearbola, not just the Ebola.
Absolutely. So, and actually, what I've been saying in the courses that I've been giving is that there's two major issues within this Ebola crisis. Fearbola, so that's the escalation of fear into panic, and everybody just completely panicking really about the spread of Ebola and whether or not they're going to get it and how it's going to escalate within the country and the world. And the second is actual managing Ebola and not letting it spread, not letting it turn into a pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And so Fearbola is very real, and and that's what I love about the first case where Emory University Hospital, I mean, Fearbola took over their Facebook page in particular when they brought in those two missionary doctors. And instead of turning off the page, instead of just continuing to communicate the way that they were communicating, because obviously it wasn't working, they actually took the time to filter through and assess what was actually going on, what's the root of all of this backlash and outrage that's happening on our wall and all over online throughout America. And they realized that the answer was a lack of education on both Ebola, how it spread and contracted, and how Emory University Hospital was capable and dedicated to not letting Ebola pass through their walls while they were taking care of these two missionary doctors. And once they assessed that and figured that out, they changed their communication strategy, and it worked. For them, it worked at that time. It started to escalate again, of course, after the Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital, after Duncan died, and after the two nurses, of course, were diagnosed. So the two nurses that were diagnosed are those that are two of the nurses that cared for Mr. Duncan, which understandably brought everybody up to, backlash on the CDC. You told us that you had it under control. Obviously you don't. Why did these two nurses contract the disease? Why was one of them allowed to fly on a plane while she was in her 21-day incubation cycle? And all of these questions. So and you wrote a really great blog post, actually, I think yesterday or the day before.
Yeah, it's, I think about 3 days ago.
I was late to find it.
That's all right. Thank you.
So talk about your two questions.
Well, the questions I had on my blog post, number one is, it is critical to find out how that nurse got exposed and how she contracted Ebola. That unknown out there is huge. And it's huge for two reasons. One is the clinical aspect, but two, it needs to be identified so that it's not repeated. As I mentioned in the blog, I suspect that it was probably as a result of, one, not wearing the proper PPE or personal protective equipment, gowns, hoods, face shield, either not the right type or was not fully covered. Or two, it was a lapse in proper decontamination procedures. And that's really tricky. I've watched in my time in the fire service and also as a paramedic, I've had to don and doff hazardous materials gear and gowns and such, face shields, hoods, shoe covers to deal with critically injured and in some cases sick patients with viruses and communicable diseases. And you have to practice it to do it right. You have to practice it to do it right all the time. And so I think that's why it's really important that they get the word out, not just on if they can find out how she contracted it, but also, okay, what did we learn here? What was there a misstep? Was there the wrong type of equipment being worn? Gowns, gloves, lack of a hood. I know that the Nurses Association is up in arms, and some of the nurses at that hospital are out risking their basically their jobs, publicly talking about that they were wearing gowns and hoods that left the neck exposed. And they weren't properly covered up. And in fact, there's pictures being passed around on the internet. I even saw this morning about that, reinforcing that. So all of these issues need to be looked at or need to be addressed right now. And actually, they're almost too late in it. But it's still a learning opportunity for all of the other hospitals and the medical facilities out there, and the first responders, for that matter, who may, and I'm sure right now, are assessing their own capabilities, and they're looking for very clear direction and guidance, updated guidance from the CDC, from the states, from their local health departments on what they need to be doing to make sure their employees don't suffer a similar fate. So that's the answer to question number one. What was question number two? I'm spacing right now.
Question number two, actually, I have it open. But before we go to question number two,
sure.
Just because I think, when it comes to the travel thing, I agree with you. I think that not putting a ban on travel is the right decision simply because the CDC is working with TSA to screen people prior to getting on board coming from these countries in West Africa, screening them when they get off, taking down all of their information, their contact information, where they're staying, who they're staying with, who they've been in contact with. They won't be able to do that if, like you said, if they ban, because people are gonna find sneaky ways and hide the illness or hide the risk of the illness and sneaky ways to still get into the country. But
Right.
However, I completely agree. And actually, one thing that I don't understand is when Mr. Duncan was brought to Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital, I mean, it's quoted out there that the hospital said that they had to learn on the fly. That's a direct quote. It's also quoted that they felt that they were inadequately underprepared to have Mr. Duncan. So my question really is, I know that it's a big job to train everybody properly across the country, but it's a job that absolutely needs to be going on right now and needed to be going on before Mr. Duncan became infected. And why did they feel, if they felt that they were underprepared, why was he brought there and left there? I know that CDC sent a team in immediately that day, but obviously, I mean, while I was watching the House of Representatives yesterday, they were clearly saying that, yeah, you're right, there's different suits, there's different hazmat gear for the different levels of exposure or of risk, I guess, of Ebola. And they were, at the beginning, when they were treating Mr. Duncan, they didn't have shoe covers, and I believe their eyes and their neck, if not just their neck, were exposed. So shoe covers were brought in later. So there was so much time for the risk of conception, really. And it happened. 2 nurses are now suffering from Ebola. So I think that's the biggest, and I've read so many articles now lately in the last week where nurses are saying, we just don't feel prepared. I know that we've been given protocols, we read our protocols, but we feel underprepared. We don't know, we don't feel adequately prepared. And that's a really big statement, first for the general public, and second for not just nurses, but everybody from, like you mentioned in your post, emergency responders, to people taking the x-rays, to people transporting the stretchers. I mean, everybody in this chain of caring for people with potential Ebola, whether they're diagnosed or before they're diagnosed, there needs to be a higher degree of training. And to hear that nurses are feeling underprepared, for me, that is the biggest mark on this whole management of this crisis, the CDC's efforts. I understand that there's measures in place, but I just don't feel that they're strong enough. They're not doing that. They're not accomplishing that quick enough.
I would agree with you, and actually, that reminded me. That's the second part of that was my second question I asked: is how prepared are the hospitals and providers to take care of this? Because really, it's a hazardous material, right?
Yes.
Ebola is a hazardous material. It's an extremely scary one because you can't see it. It takes 21 days to kick in, so you don't know if you have it. And during that period of time, it's like a ticking time bomb. So it's an extremely scary thing, and I suspect that with the infection of that first healthcare worker, that's a seminal event for the U.S. and actually the worldwide health community on saying, "Whoa, wait a second here. This is a game changer. This is we're no longer confident, or we should not be confident in saying, hey, we're a first world country. We've got the greatest medical care. We're not like West Africa where there's very minimal medical care. We've got all the latest diagnostic equipment. We have all the money in the world. We've got these isolation wards we can put in place. And that doesn't mean squat. The people on the front lines, and it goes all the way to the janitors who clean up afterwards, not only need to be educated, they need to physically do it. They need to do drills, scenarios. They need to practice and get competent and confident in adequately donning and doffing their PPE and working in an environment. And they also have to gain confidence that the organizations they work for are looking out for their best interests. And that means having an incident, what I call the incident command system, or an incident management system in place, an organizational management structure that puts their safety as number one priority. And, I saw a very excellent article yesterday that talked about in the medical community, especially emergency rooms, operating rooms, doctors and nurses don their surgical scrub gear with the primary goal of preventing infection of the patient. Right? Mm-hmm. This is the exact opposite, this situation.
Yes, it is.
And when you're talking about a culture inside of hospitals and medical facilities, I think there's a kind of an underlying, not feeling, but culture, or that's their normal role as they operate that way. Well, they need to change that mindset. They're putting that gear on to protect them, not the patient. And until that is clearly communicated and accepted across the board, I'm afraid we could see additional exposures. And I think that's what the nurses associations and even the International Association of Fire Chiefs and the International Association of Firefighters, the IAFC and the IAFF, have put out very clear guidance here this week to all of their members about what they need to be doing as first responders in making sure that they are fully protected in the event that they are called to treat a patient with suspected Ebola. And I think it's going to happen. I just don't see any way around it. I know it's going to happen because the Fearbola is rolling around out there. Somebody who has some kind of intestinal disease unrelated to Ebola but shows similar signs and symptoms, they're going to be treated like they have it. So I think it's extremely important that the number one, the hospitals and the medical facilities acknowledge that, okay, we can't be cavalier about this. We can't just assume we throw a couple of gowns on and some booties and a couple pairs of gloves and a face shield and a hood that our folks are going to be adequately protected, because they need to practice it and make sure that they operate in a way that they don't open themselves up to exposure. And they need to be closely watched by the agencies that they work for as they're performing these procedures and interacting with these patients to make sure they're not putting themselves in a position or something happens that they have no control over where they could be potentially exposed. And when it's hazardous materials situations that we deal with, the fire service deals with, they assign a safety officer whose sole job is to oversee the operations of the what we call entrants or team members who are working in the hot zone or the red zone and monitor their safety throughout the incident until they're fully decontaminated. And that kind of approach should be job one of all of the hospitals and medical facilities in the United States.
I completely agree. Actually, that was a big part of your post that I really, really liked that you stated. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold and it's getting the best of me. But what was I going to say? And I've as well read. And okay, hold on. Let me start at the beginning. They can't just be told, and you're right in that. They can't just be told, the nurses and the staff, on how to put on these hazmat gears. They need to practice it. I'm a big fan of simulations. This is a simulation that needs to occur once or twice daily for those on duty. And having somebody, I've read that nurses and doctors, they're so used to putting on surgical gloves. That's part of their daily routine that they don't consciously think of, just for this example, of how they're removing them all the time. It's just natural, muscle memory at this point. And they need to overcome that now. They need to be conscious of how they're doing all of these things. So I definitely agree that there needs to be practice so that mistakes don't get made in the heat of the moment, and that there needs to be a safety officer that's even just having a safety officer there as a presence to watch the procedures will remind subconsciously those, removing or putting on the gear of the severity and to do it cautiously. Mm-hmm. So even just there as a subconscious reminder, it would be important.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
In terms of, and there's an example that I love to talk about. Before we were talking about the airline and how they're taking that proactive approach to go above and beyond and to really communicate and show to their clients, their customers, and the world that they're taking it seriously. Boston Public Health Commission, I believe, did a really great job of that right after Emory University Hospital went through what they went through. I don't know if you remember, but Boston Public Health Commission came out and held about a 23-minute conference or press conference that said, at the time, Ebola is not here. It's not in Boston. However, we do identify it as a risk. And because of that, this is the plan that we've put in motion to make sure that our citizens are safe. And if Ebola were to come to Boston, we want you to know that we have, X, Y, Z set up, and this is what you can count on us for, and this is what will be dedicated to doing, and we have this plan in motion. And they put together, like I said, a 23-minute press conference that they then took that video and put it across their social channels on their website that just talked about all of those steps and all of that plan that they've put together. And that this is what communities need to be doing right now to help with this Fearbola. They need to be taking proactive steps to calming the fears of, or doing what they can to calm the fears within their own city limits. Just think of Bostonians that night went to bed and said, okay, it's a risk, we all knew that, but at least we know that our city is on top of it.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with that. And it's not just the citizens, it's also the employees and those first responders, if you will, both in the hospital and the actual first responders on the street. That you need those folks need to have that level of confidence as well. And I would assume the fact that they stood up, those agency heads stood up there jointly and gave that press conference. I would assume then in the background, behind the scenes work and training has been ongoing for a period of time, and they're working towards having that level of competence in addressing all of the issues that have surfaced over the past week down in Texas.
Yeah, it's something that everybody who has some sort of role in this crisis needs to be thinking of, and needs to be, like we said, there's two issues here. There's actually managing the crisis of Ebola and not letting it spread, and there's managing the Fearbola and not letting that escalate and spread. And this is the Fearbola part of it is something that we can be doing proactively within, whether from every angle, actually, within different communities. And I do believe that it needs to be every state or every city needs to work with their different agencies, their different officials, and the different partners that are responsible for doing this, and they need to come out with something proactive like Boston did.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that it's interesting about the Texas situation, from my view in the cheap seats, is I'm only directly hearing, or we're only directly hearing from two entities, the hospital and the CDC.
You're right.
Both of them are on the front lines, are under fire for the handling of this. But the reality is the CDC provides guidance, they provide resources, but it's really up to the states and the local governments to support directly, through their health departments, to support the health facilities down there. And interestingly enough, I'm not hearing much from them. I'm hearing a lot of finger pointing back at the CDC saying, hey, we were following guidelines, CDC did this. But really, for this thing to be effective going forward, there needs to be a very highly visible partnership and unified command approach among all of the legally mandated public agencies in dealing with this situation. And again, I keep falling back to the hazmat role. Under hazmat, on a large-scale event, by law, there's a federal representative, a state representative, a local representative, and then what's called the responsible party, whoever spilled the bad stuff. They're required to work together on a unified command approach to mitigate the incident. And I'm not seeing that here. I got online and I read some media statements by the governor of Texas, who curiously is really, and I'm not seeing much, I'm not hearing hardly anything from him, but I read a couple online statements, and really that's it. And then a statement by the health commissioner in Dallas County, but I'm not seeing I'm not hearing a real strong team approach here, and I find that kind of curious.
I'm finding that curious as well. And why do you think that is? Do you think I would think that it's a lack of preparedness. I would think that their own fear probably has something to do with it. And just if nurses are feeling underprepared, for example, and they're getting some form of training or at least some protocols handed to them, I don't know if I think that these officials need to, I don't know, maybe they're working on something, maybe they're looking into who they can hire as as a consultant to come in and help them manage this. But it's curious that they're not being more proactive.
Yeah, and again, I'm in the cheap seats here, and there may be some stuff going on behind the scenes. I'm sure there is that we're not aware of, but just at a surface level, I am not seeing a total team approach. I'm not seeing the CDC director standing side by side with, or not CDC director, but CDC representatives, whoever's down there in Dallas, and all of these key agency heads sitting together saying, we're working together on this, we're all in this together. I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing finger pointing and even press statements saying, okay, we were following CDC guidelines here, folks. We're doing the best we can, but really, the CDC's, they're almost getting thrown under the bus to a certain point. When I read some of the comments, I'm going, okay, wait a second here.
Oh, absolutely.
The CDC can't monitor whether a nurse fully covers up or not, or making sure that physically watches the blood samples being transported to the lab, or the soiled disposable garments are disposed of properly. I mean, all of that happens at a local level, and I just find it really curious. The other thing I think that's going on here, I mean, credibility for the CDC and actually the Texas Fraternity Hospital has taken a major hit with this. There's no doubt about it. And what there's gonna have to be a major change, or something major, drastic it's going to really have to happen to reestablish the credibility. There needs to be somebody placed into a position or positions that can exert effective crisis leadership, because as we talked about, Fearbola is it's irrational fear, right? But it's still fear. And how you get over that fear and how you educate people is you got to have somebody in place who has a history and an ability to exert strong leadership skills, so that people will really listen and are willing to be educated and accept what they're hearing, so that you can take away this irrational fear. And I'm not seeing that yet. I think the CDC's director's credibility is shot on this topic. I think he'll need to be either replaced or do something else, and they need to bring somebody in, hopefully, that has that experience and the ability to effectively demonstrate crisis leadership. It's almost similar to what I kind of equate it to how Hurricane Katrina was handled back in 2005, where the FEMA director was down there and his credibility took a hit. And it wasn't until the Army came in and they brought, and I can't remember the general's name, who stood on a street corner and in a matter of about an hour in front of the cameras exerted or demonstrated profound crisis leadership that told the country, at least, and told me at least, that, okay, the cavalry's here, things are going to happen, changes are going to be made, we're going to take care of this problem starting right now. And hopefully the president and the governor of Texas and the county commissioner or whatever of Dallas County are talking together and figuring out, is there somebody do we have somebody in the hopper that we can place into a role? And right before the interview started, I heard that the president has assigned a person to be the Ebola czar, quote unquote, if you will.
Yeah, I read that too.
But I don't have any, it remains to be seen whether that is the right person to put in that spot. Hopefully it is, and maybe they are taking steps in that way, but I really think that's what it's going to take. And the other thing that I'm interesting, it's going to be interesting to see how this goes, is, and you and I both, as crisis communicators, understand the importance of engagement, right? Mm-hmm. That it isn't just putting out a media release. It isn't just standing up like Boston did, standing up in front of a bunch of cameras in a conference room and talking to the public. There needs to be a level of engagement. And I looked at the various CDC Twitter accounts, Facebook posts, things like that. There's good information going out, but I'm not seeing yet a strong level of engagement with the public, that they are actively listening and responding to concerns from the public. And I think it's going to take that as well to kind of turn the ship of credibility and education back towards their goals.
It's interesting that you say that. It's what I see the same thing. However, I do see, they keep putting out these graphics. So I guess they're mini infographics, which is a good strategy when you want communicate. Infographics get spread very, very quickly. Often they go viral for a short amount of time. So it's a good strategy to make it visual, to make it easy to share. However, just a sideline on that, they're not really making it easy to share. when you go to the page that these infographics are on, the web page, there's no links or not. There's no tweet this now button. There's no
Right.
embed codes. Like if Agnes Day creates an infographic, we publish it on our blog. We provide at the bottom of that infographic actual HTML code that says you could take this code and put it directly onto your website to share this further. So there's no sharing capabilities like that we should see to go a step beyond. In terms of responding to people, I agree. They're not having this two-way discussion. I do understand that at this point they're neck deep into this, though there should be resources dedicated to this task. What I see them doing is they're probably monitoring and they're responding with these infographics and with the communication. So they're probably instead of responding to people directly, they're saying, okay, a lot of people are talking about this or asking about this, let's put out information on that type thing.
I totally agree with that. I think that they are shaping their message based on feedback or based on what they're seeing online, no doubt about it. With that said, though, these are government agencies, right? Mm-hmm. So they got two strikes against them to begin with. Trust me, I'm from the government. That's a funny line everybody says, but strategic direct engagement with the public, whether sample messages or not sample messages, but representative messages. Okay, this person has said this. Well, this person has said this, and 560 other people retweeted it and said they agreed and shared that message with theirs. Okay, I'm going to respond to that person.
Absolutely, and
I'm going to say, we hear you. We're taking care. Here's what you can do to help us. That kind of thing. I think they need to be doing that.
Absolutely. And I mean, even if they wanted to continue with the strategy that they're going, so they're taking questions that come out and they're making, for example, a visual infographic type, take that and share that with that person who then got retweeted 500 times. If you don't want to respond to them directly and do that 1,000,000 times, have one visual response so it doesn't look like a canned response, and share it directly with them. Mention them in your sharing of it. Mm-hmm. Another thing that actually was that we're not seeing is when you go to the cdc.gov website and you go to their Ebola section, there's no actual. They have a button at the top of the page that says, Facebook, recommend, tweet, and then some other share buttons. But there's no mention. I mean, CDC is using #Ebola in all of their communications, which I believe to be the right hashtag. But they're not mentioning that anywhere on this site to say you can follow this hashtag. There's also no feed. I mean, talking about two-way communications, you would want to see some form of an integration of what's going on Twitter in particular onto this site, into the sidebar or something. So yes. A live stream of that so that people feel like they can be a part of the discussion, whether it's directly with the CDC or jump in to talk to other people who are talking about it. There's none of that on this site, which I found, considering that they're very proactive on social in terms of disseminating information, I thought that was very interesting, and I was actually kind of surprised to see that there was none of that on this site.
Yeah, I would agree. On the sites I've seen so far on this issue, they're almost all they're posting on social media, but there isn't the level of sophistication that most people expect now. And I also think that, as we both know, that smartphone integration and having platforms, websites, or whatever set up specific to how people now get their information on their platforms, that integration needs to take place. And I'm not seeing it. I'm seeing a traditional website that everybody's getting pointed to for the latest information. Where's the app?
Yeah. Well, their website, I just checked. It is good that their website is responsive. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But I absolutely agree. Apps we know, especially for emergency management, apps with geotargeting, with push notifications, with the ability for real-time two-way communications, whether it's internal, external, apps are lifesavers.
Right. And maybe they're working on that. I mean, as we all know, they've been behind they've been behind their curve on this, which is part of the reason why their credibility is shot. So maybe they're working on that now, but it can't happen soon enough.
Well, hopefully we'll see something there. One thing that I do agree with, somebody asked me, I was giving a guest lecture this week, and the question came up. Actually, the question always comes up no matter what I'm doing, is whether or not the use of dark websites should be used. And so I actually went to go check, and because I wasn't 100% sure, and I was happy when I found that the CDC's, all of their information on Ebola on their site is not a dark website. It's not. It's part of cdc.gov. It's an extension of that site. So it's, I guess, a microsite within their common site, within their regular site, which is very important because a dark website is something that gets removed after the crisis. This information cannot be removed from the web. Not in 2 years, not in 5 years. This information needs to stay there for those researching in the future, for those with questions in the future, and God forbid, if Ebola were to come back after this crisis, it needs to be there. So I was actually very happy to see that they weren't using some form of a dark site.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Little things that I check. But it's dark websites actually is a big question that I get asked all the time in different conferences and workshops. People don't really grasp it. There's really good times to use a dark website, and there's really good alternatives when it's not a good time to use a dark website.
Yeah, this particular case with that this attacks the fabric of our culture and our society. This is not a one-off event where, this has legacy written all over it.
Oh yeah.
And I would agree with you. It has to stay. It has to be at the forefront of all communications going forward.
Yep. It needs to be searchable for those, even just researchers looking, whether it's students, whether it's practitioners, whether it's whoever it is, researchers in the future that want to know how and learn from this case study. In 5 years, it needs to still be found.
Absolutely. Actually, there needs to be some short-term lessons being done right now by researchers, especially on the crisis communications piece.
Oh, absolutely. I'm hoping that some people, the right people, might come across this podcast. I'm hoping that the right people are out there and actually doing that, and then hopefully taking that into the internal communications of the CDC, of the different hospitals, of all of everywhere around actually the world. I hope that we start to see some little bit better communication.
Agreed.
Happening. I got a comment on one of my posts this week from a regular reader he's from somewhere else. I'm not really sure, but I can tell that I don't know where he's from, but his English isn't perfect when he writes. But he started saying, CDC keeps telling us that Ebola can't be contracted from eating food, contaminated food, but in the UK they're telling us that it can be. You can eat food and get Ebola. And I thought that was interesting. I actually went and researched, and Ebola apparently was originally contracted in West Africa through a type of meat that they kill and eat, and I think that the culture is that they eat it raw. I'm really, nobody can quote me on this. This is some, very minimal research I've done on it. But so that's how it was contracted. But I was happy to see actually today that the CDC was putting out information on you cannot catch Ebola from eating food that is from the U.S. In particular. I mean, they're speaking to U.S. citizens. So I thought that it's very interesting to see all of what Fearbola is doing.
Oh yeah, the questions being generated, it's being made. Yeah, and then of course there's your government conspirators out there, that this is all concocted by the government. I mean, there's some really far-fetched stuff out there.
Yeah, that comes with everything.
Oh yeah.
Everything. I mean, look at the crises we've seen this year. Look at just Malaysia Airlines, both of their 2 flights, the things that came out. I've sat with some very interesting people that, kind of have their own speculations to certain things, and you can tell that they've probably just experienced too much, and it's probably time for them to take a vacation.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's fun. Though I do, one thing actually, I was with an EMD, Emergency Management Department, recently, and one thing that caught my eye and stuck with me was the head of the department said something about if a major catastrophe were to strike our city, we believe that we have 72 hours to communicate with the people before they lose faith in us. And I just wanted to say that out loud on this podcast. 72 hours is not right.
No, 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 no. In fact, it's I would, if I was there, I would have countered.
Oh,
I
yes,
would have, I
that it
would
was
have said,
countered, and a big
you
lesson
have
was learned from it.
72 seconds.
Yeah, well, that's it. So, of course, while I was there, I did, I countered that, and I corrected, and we talked about it. But if people who really this is an emergency management department, that just, I guess maybe one person within it, or just didn't really grasp the reality, and that kind of struck me as he or she can't be alone. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there because it still shocks me. It's like, don't you read my blog, people?
Yeah. Well, that's somebody that hasn't physically or really experienced
The reality.
crisis since 2009. I mean, I submit that the public expectation for communication changed back in around 2009 when smartphones and 4G networks came out, and people have the ability to instantly connect with each other and their social media platforms. Once that happened, it changed the dynamic about how crisis leaders need to communicate.
And I completely agree. If you look back to 2009, the very first two major crises that happened and evolved online were Domino's Pizzas, employees doing disgusting things to the food, and United Breaks Guitars, both of which happened in 2009. And they were the first two case studies of that magnitude. They were the first of their kind. Mm-hmm. Both happened in 2009. So, good assessment.
I think the other thing that's worth mentioning here too in our discussion, the role that what I call mainstream media, but our syndicated cable news networks have played in this. I think that in the initial stages of this, I frankly put partial blame on Fearbola on them sensationalizing this situation. Even last night, I was in the changing into my gym clothes at my gym, and they have a TV in the locker room, and they have a helicopter following the ambulance transporting one of the nurses to the hospital, the hospital out of state. I can't remember the name of it. And it struck me that I'm standing there looking at this going, this is the OJ low-speed chase all over again. That news organizations are, and I understand, they got to get ratings, and Fox and CNN are pretty strong competition with each other. But it was pretty disheartening to see, especially, and I think part of that is due to a lack of crisis leadership. So it makes it easy to jump into that kind of realm of news reporting. But on the other hand, I was very heartened and pleased to see Shepard Smith's 3-minute.
Oh yeah, I saw
Let's
that.
get real, people, about Ebola. I thought that was actually excellent reporting by Fox, by him in particular, trying to bring some reality to this situation and calm everybody down. And in some ways, I thought that was a form of crisis leadership that I felt really needed to be told. And the way he did it, I thought it was very effective communication.
We're seeing since 2009, we're seeing all of these, people, whether reporters or citizen journalists, whatever it is, there's lack of fact checking. There's this hype around sensationalizing, absolutely, for selling ratings and, gaining traffic. And I'm eager to see, I do believe, well, the media has always been the media. They've always done that. So, but I agree. Shepard Smith's, I saw his 3 minutes video, and I was like you. I just thought, good for you, and good. That is a leader, and it's nice to see the leaders emerge. I have another podcast with Jane Jordan-Meyer on leadership in a crisis, and Jane says a true leader emerges in a crisis. And that's absolutely correct. And that's something that we did see there. And I would hope, I mean, just for moral and ethical reasons, I disagree with the whole sensationalizing, especially with understanding the risk of Fearbola and how susceptible and how impressionable citizens are, and how they look to the news often for the facts and to help guide where their emotion is going to be. So to sensationalize the negative and to highlight, to add fuel, say, to Fearbola is just, it's something beyond my comprehension, or my understanding of how organizations can do that. But I also understand the risk of the panic, and I also understand that it is part of their job and something that we as communicators, whether we have a direct role in this crisis or others, or an indirect one, we kind of have to do our part to counter that as much as we can, as do the CDC, as do the hospitals taking care of Ebola patients, as do everybody else. And, part of the challenge today in a crisis, no matter what, is getting ahead of the news cycle. It's getting ahead of the headlines and becoming the narrative of your own crisis. And that is these organizations' responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a recent example of that, which I felt was, it was a very, very high visibility event, created panic across the United States, but in particular in Boston, was the marathon bombing. And the Boston Police Department's absolutely outstanding crisis leadership and communication with the public, both on social media tools and with mainstream media, in monitoring, engaging, and correcting misinformation that was being broadcast by fairly reputable news organizations, CNN, Reuters, BBC, all of them were repeating bad information because everybody's wants to get the breaking news, wants to get to be the first to report new information. And in today's environment, taking a tweet that's not verified and blasting it out there to everybody saying we're getting reports of this, not only is irresponsible, it could be dangerous. And I thought the Boston Police Department, in particular Deputy Commissioner John Daly, did an absolutely outstanding job at crisis communication during that not only highly visible, but fast evolving crisis for the city of Boston.
Absolutely, I completely agree. That one is for any leader out there who wants to read a case study of absolutely great crisis leadership. There's a few reports that have been and studies that came out of that crisis that are available on the web that you just look for, and it's definitely a case study to learn from.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Bill, it's been such a pleasure. I love talking about this because there's so many, one, because it's happening now, it's in the moment, it's real time, but there's so many lessons for anybody listening to gain from this entire crisis, how it's being managed, the good, the bad, and hopefully we've put some wisdom out to others or helped them in their journey of their own personal crisis planning and crisis management. So thank you for taking the time.
Oh, you bet. I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed it.
Likewise. So, Bill, where can everybody find and follow you?
Well, I've got a blog. It's chiefb2.com. I'm part of the First Arriving Network, and I'm on Twitter at chiefb2, the number 2, so CHIEF B2. I also partner with Gerald Barron on occasion and do crisis communications consulting along with Patrice Coultier, Gerald Barron through Agincourt Strategies, and they're on the web as well. Yeah,
Patrice and I have Patrice writes for my blog every once in a while, and we have a podcast together too. It's a good listen.
Yep. So that's how you can find me, or my email is chiefb22inator@gmail.com.
I like that. All of your information will be linked to from the bottom of this podcast, whether people are listening to it from the blog, the Crisis Intelligence blog, or from iTunes or Stitcher. So thank you again. I had a great time chatting with you.
Same here.
Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this week's episode of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. I release a new episode every Sunday, so if you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to the Crisis Intelligence Podcast over on the Crisis Intelligence blog at agnesday.com/blog or on iTunes or on Stitcher. And while you're at it, head on over to iTunes and Stitcher and would really appreciate it if you left us a review and your feedback. You can also follow me on Twitter at Melissa_Agnes. And if you'd like to reach out to me to ask me a follow-up question from this week or a past podcast, or if you'd like to discuss the possibility of having me come and speak at an upcoming event, then you could email me directly at magnes@agnesday.com. Thanks so much for tuning in this week, and I look forward to talking even more crisis intelligence with you next Sunday.